Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When I was a child, my family went to church every Sunday, with only the rarest exception. And I must say that I was not always a big fan of this. During the school year, you really enjoyed those weekends where you didn't have to do much of anything in the morning. When I first was drafting that, I thought, oh, those weekends where you can sleep in, but let's be honest, when you're a kid, you just don't really sleep in. As much as your parents may wish you would, you just don't. But you do like having that free time in the morning. But then on Sunday, you got to get up early and go to church. And although I don't remember this, undoubtedly, at some point, I must have asked my parents, why do we go to church? I was old enough to know not everybody went to church. And depending on how old I was, my parents would have probably said something like, because God tells us to, which is kind of a fancier version of saying, because I said so, isn't it? And undoubtedly later in life, they would have given me a more nuanced answer. Now, I've often talked about, well, why do we go to church? And usually, I have focused on how the church is a community that nurtures our faith, a community that protects us when we're vulnerable, a community that strengthens us when we're weak. And those are all very important things. But today I want to talk about another reason why we go to church. So today we shift from the Gospel of Luke to its sequel, the Acts of the Apostles. Now, we don't actually know who wrote these two books, but scholars are reasonably sure that they were both written by the same person. In fact, they might have even constituted a single book at one time, Luke and Acts, because Acts is a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. This part of Acts relays stories about the early church in Jerusalem. Our reading for today kind of breaks into three parts. First, there's this conflict in the church that leads to the appointment of some new officials. Then we read about Stephen and his conflict with other Greek-speaking Jews. And then we hear Stephen's speech to the council, which ends with him being killed by stoning. Our reading begins with this conflict between Jewish Christians who spoke Aramaic and Jewish Christians who spoke Greek. At this point, the Christian church would have been almost entirely Jewish still. The Greek-speaking widows, that's what we're calling the Hellenists here in the reading, complain that they are being neglected from the food distribution. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those widows are themselves in need. The wording is such that it may very well be that these widows are themselves ministers who are responsible for caring for others. And that's why they require food. Either way, these widows feel like they are being left out. The disciples decide that they must focus on the Word of God and prayer, so they have the community choose leaders who can oversee this food distribution. 7 people are chosen. All of them have Greek names, which strongly suggest that they are all Hellenists, that is, Jews from outside of Palestine who grew up speaking Greek. Now, the word isn't used here, but these 7 are widely considered to be the first deacons. And in fact, the office of deacon in our church is inspired by this tradition here. We're told that one of them, Nikolaos, was actually a convert to Judaism before joining the church. But the focus of the narrative quickly moves to Stephen, one of the 7. We're told he was full of grace and power and did great wonders and signs among the people. We're told that Stephen gets into a conflict with some of the other Greek-speaking Jews who were not Christians, and it gets very ugly. Eventually, his opponents bring him before the council and accuse him of blasphemy. His accusers speak, and then the high priest gives Stephen the opportunity to defend himself, and he ends up giving a quite lengthy speech, which only a small portion is included in today's reading, that retells the history of Israel, highlighting Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. It is an inflammatory speech focusing on Israel's persistent historic disobedience. Stephen critiques the temple, although it's important to remember that when Acts was written, the temple had been destroyed for some time. Then he criticizes the leadership for executing Jesus, whom he identifies as innocent. And this enrages the council and leads to a mob attacking Stephen and killing him by stoning. And let's be honest, let's call this what this is. This would be a lynching. Stephen prays for his killers, and then he dies, becoming the first martyr of Christianity. Now, there is a lot going on in this reading. We have conflict in the church. We have conflict between church leadership and the larger community. We have the involvement of the authorities. Then we have a mob murder of a Jewish Christian leader. There are many directions someone can go with this. And I'd encourage you all to think about some of those other directions this week, because I don't have time, unfortunately, to discuss them, but undoubtedly some of you will have some thoughts about this. Because it's a powerful story where I think we can see ourselves in different characters in this story. Sometimes we can be good people. Other times we might be an angry mob. We might be victims, but we might also be aggressors. But what I want to focus on today is those Hellenist Greek-speaking widows. As I've mentioned before, widows were one of the classic victims in the ancient world, especially if they didn't have any sons. As a woman's identity was determined by the men in her life. As a child, she was under her father. As a wife, she was under her husband. And as a widow, she was under her son or sons. So widows without sons were in a very difficult spot. Yet in today's reading, we see how a group of widows are able to advocate for themselves and for those they minister to. And these are not just any widows, but Greek-speaking Jewish widows who might well have been seen as outsiders to the Aramaic-speaking Jews who lived in Palestine. These widows saw a problem, and they did something about it. They stood up. They spoke up. They demanded institutional change, and they got it. The apostles realized there was a need that they couldn't manage. So they made structural changes, creating a whole new type of leader who could manage this issue. And these leaders were drawn from an entirely new group of people. The apostles, they were all Palestinian Jews who spoke Aramaic. But this new group of leaders were all Jews from outside of Palestine that spoke Greek. This church is flexible. They saw they were missing something important, and they made a major change, a major course correction. Boy, that is not an easy thing to do. Just think of how long it takes us to update church bylaws. And by a funny coincidence, both Bethany and St. John are holding congregational meetings today where bylaws will be voted on. Yay! But the point I want to make is that the church created a space for this marginalized group, the Greek-speaking widows, to advocate for themselves and those they served, and it adjusted in response to their critique. And that is an important lesson for us today. Because the church needs to be a safe space for people to reflect on their situation and realize that they need to fight for something or someone. The church also needs to be able to take that criticism into account, make changes, needs to be flexible. So the church is both a vehicle for social change, but also itself must be open to that change, which is not an easy thing. We see examples, though, of this in the 1960s when the black church in particular was pivotal in the fight for civil rights. Unfortunately, many white churches also joined in that struggle. Our own United Church of Christ played a role in that movement. In the 1980s, many churches were involved in the sanctuary movement, where churches sheltered activists from Central America, when our government wanted to just send them back to repressive governments where they would have been persecuted or even killed. Many churches have fought for the environment, or for the persecuted around the world, or against government policies that hurt the poor. Just this last week, the Reverend Dr. William Barber from our partner denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, was arrested for praying in the Capitol Rotunda in D.C. Just think about it. Church is one place where a person without a fancy job, or without much money, or without an education can become an important community leader, a voice for the voiceless. And we go to church because at its best, church creates a space for regular folk to fight for themselves and to fight for others, just like those widows in the book of Acts. Church is the place where we can look around and say, hey, this is not right. Something needs to be done about this. That is, I think, one of the amazing things about the church, is the fact that at its best, it can nurture people to rise up, to see what's wrong, and to advocate for change. And at its best, the church can say, you're right, we need to change. Now, does that always happen? No. Sadly, it doesn't. It is very easy for churches, just like any other big organization, to become kind of stuck in their ways. Now, that would never happen to Bethany. We would never get stuck in our ways. But other churches could get stuck in their ways. Actually, we're not terrible. I don't think we're too bad about that. But it's always the temptation any of us can fall into, right? We can all get stuck in our ways. I get stuck in my ways. And then somebody will say, well, Chris, why do you do it that way? Why don't you do it this way? I'm like, I never thought of that. But at its best, the church cultivates people, gives them a space to grow and to realize, wait a minute, there's something not right here. Something needs to be changed. And the church at its best makes changes to accommodate some of those needs. With those apostles, they were able to say, you know what? This isn't about us. This isn't about our egos. This isn't about how important we think we are. This is about making sure the mission of the church is fulfilled. The needs of the community are met. So you know what? Appoint this group of 7 leaders, and they will take charge of that. We'll focus on the word, we'll focus on prayer, and these 7 deacons, they will take care of all this stuff. They were willing to basically delegate authority. That's not always easy. It's tempting sometimes when we're like, well, I don't know if I want somebody else to do it. They may not do as good of a job as I would do. It's like, well, maybe not, but you know what? You need to let other people take charge sometimes. And that's not always easy either. But I think that's the lesson I really want us to take away from this passage today. Those Hellenist widows, they were able to stand up, say, this is not right, please fix this. And the apostles, to their credit, said, you're right. And they made the change. That is what I think the church at its best needs to be. Okay, amen.